Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. Camping experience gone wrong. When I was 11 years old, our school organized a 2-day, 1-night camping trip on the school grounds. It was a private school tucked away in a small town in Pasir Ris, far from the bustling cities of Malaysia. For privacy reasons, I won't name the school. The event was exclusively for 5th grade students, a group of 229 kids, both boys and girls. The first day was full of the usual excitement, setting up tents, team games, and a lot of chatter. The evening transitioned smoothly into the night, with a barbecue session kicking off around 10 p.m. Our group of 32 friends, a tight-knit mix of boys and girls from different backgrounds, was loud, laughing, and eager for some spooky fun. Among us were my 6 closest friends, all notorious for dabbling in ghost stories and exploring the supernatural. That night, however, carried a darker undertone. It was Malam Kamis, Thursday night, which in local belief is when spirits are most active. As a joke, I began mimicking eerie howls, trying to spook everyone. It was all laughs until Amira, one of my best friends, let out a sudden scream. Her face turned pale as she pointed towards the old bell tower perched above the administration building. "There are red eyes staring at us from there," she yelled. Several other students, mostly the braver ones, claimed they saw it too. When the rest of us looked up, the eyes had vanished. But the atmosphere shifted instantly. An icy dread washed over us all. Despite the growing unease, our teachers remained oblivious, too absorbed in keeping the event running smoothly. Meanwhile, a hush fell over the students as an unsettling tension took hold. The block behind us housed the 6th grade classrooms and was shrouded in darkness. It seemed to loom ominously in the night. As if drawn by an unseen force, some of us edged closer to the building, straining our eyes, hoping, yet dreading, to catch a glimpse of something. I was one of those who stepped forward, my curiosity outweighing the creeping fear. And then I saw her. Standing on the 4th floor, right at the end of the corridor near the girls' bathroom, was a woman. Her face was obscured by long, tangled black hair, and she wore a white dress smeared with blood. The figure was deathly still, but her presence was unmistakably sinister. My heart nearly stopped when I realized she was staring directly at us, and more terrifyingly, that was my classroom. The sight was paralyzing. The silence shattered as chaos erupted. Some students bolted towards the tents, while others screamed and burst into tears. A few rushed to the nearby toilets in groups, unable to handle the sheer terror that had taken hold. I remained rooted in place, my legs refusing to move as I kept my eyes locked on that figure. She never moved an inch, yet her presence suffocated us with an overwhelming sense of dread. Despite the panic, our teachers insisted we continue the night's activities in the assembly hall. They dismissed our claims as overactive imaginations fueled by ghost stories. But no one in our group could eat or relax after what we saw. We stayed huddled together, eyes darting nervously around, fearful of another encounter. Rumors quickly spread in the days following the incident. Some claimed the school was built over an old cemetery. Others said it was once a mental asylum. Though no one could confirm these stories, what I saw was no rumor. That ghostly woman was as real as the terror we all felt. I'll never forget the way she stood there, silent and menacing, forever etched in my memory as a chilling reminder that some experiences defy logic. The camping trip was meant to be fun, but it left us with nightmares that would linger long after the tents were packed away. Who was that? For the past few months, I've been reading all sorts of paranormal stories on this platform, quietly intrigued by the experiences people share. I never thought I'd be posting one of my own, but after seeing how supportive this community is, I figured it was time. Maybe someone out there can shed light on what I encountered, or at least find my story worth the read. This happened about 3 years ago when I was a senior high school teacher. The graduating class I was assigned to was just a couple of months away from finishing school. That year, instead of the usual field trip, the school decided to do something different, a camping trip in the mountains. 3 days and 2 nights of adventure with just the students, a few selected staff members, and a whole lot of nature. The excitement was contagious, and even I was looking forward to it. The day of the camping trip arrived, and all involved faculty members were asked to come in early to prepare. It was late February, and the mornings were still cold with a thick mist hanging in the air. I remember arriving at the campus at around 5 a.m., thinking I might have shown up too early since the parking lot was practically empty except for the security guards. The school's campus was massive, known for its history and prestige, being the main branch in the province with extensions across the region. The senior high school section was housed in the oldest part of the campus, within the administrative and engineering buildings. As I walked down the long corridors leading to the faculty office, the silence was unnerving. The dim lights and echoing footsteps only added to the eerie feeling that something wasn't quite right. Our office was situated next to the principal's and guidance counselor's offices. When I arrived, it was clear that no one else had come in yet. The lights were all off. I turned them on and went straight to my desk to make some coffee while waiting for others to arrive. Just a minute or two later, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Through the large window that overlooked the hallway, I saw someone walking past the office. I assumed it was either the principal or the guidance counselor heading to their respective offices. The figure's brisk pace and the familiarity of the silhouette led me to believe it was the principal. I didn't think much of it, other than wondering why he was in so early. After a few more minutes, I decided to use the restroom and then go say good morning to whoever it was that had arrived. I finished up in the restroom and walked towards the principal's office, but when I got there, the lights were still off and the room was empty. Confused, I stood in the doorway for a moment, my mind racing. I was so certain I had seen someone go in there. Suddenly, a voice from behind startled me. "Good morning." It was the guidance counselor, cheerfully greeting me as she set up her things at her desk. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. She noticed how flustered I was and asked if I was okay. I managed a shaky response. "Yeah, I'm just here early. Have you seen the principal?" She looked at me with mild confusion as she unpacked her bag. "No, not yet. He usually arrives closer to 6 a.m. I nodded slowly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very off. Who did I see then? As more faculty members began trickling in, the principal finally arrived. When I saw him, he was wearing a completely different outfit than the one I had thought I saw earlier. My stomach churned as a cold realization set in. I had followed something else. But what? During the staff briefing before we left for the campsite, I couldn't keep it to myself. I told the principal and the guidance counselor what I had seen. To my surprise, they didn't look shocked. Instead, they exchanged knowing glances. The guidance counselor finally spoke up, saying, "You're not the first to see something like that here. This building has a history, especially the principal's office. People have reported seeing shadow figures and even hearing a child laughing late at night." The mention of a child ghost sent chills down my spine. According to them, there was a mischievous spirit that occasionally pranked people by appearing in the windows or running down hallways. The principal, in a calm but concerned tone, advised me not to worry and just focus on the camping trip ahead. "These things happen here," he said, almost nonchalantly. Despite their reassurances, the encounter weighed heavily on me as we left for the mountains. I tried to shake it off and focus on the excited students, but the image of that figure kept replaying in my mind. The camping trip itself went smoothly, filled with bonfires, hikes, and laughter. But every time we gathered around the fire at night, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure lurking just out of sight. On the last night of the trip, something happened that nearly pushed me over the edge. We had set up our tents near a dense patch of woods, and as I was doing a final check on the students, I heard faint footsteps behind me. When I turned around, there was no one there. Thinking it was just one of the kids messing around, I brushed it off and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing rustling sounds outside my tent, almost like someone or something was circling the campsite. At one point, I peeked outside, and there, near the tree line, I saw a dark figure standing motionless. I froze, unable to move or even blink. My mind raced back to that morning at school, and a terrifying thought gripped me. Had it followed me here? Just as I was about to shout for help, One of the other teachers walked by, snapping me out of my trance. I looked back towards the tree line, but the figure was gone. The rest of the night was restless, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When we returned to the school, I couldn't wait to leave and put the whole experience behind me. But deep down, I still needed answers. What did I see that morning in the principal's office? Was it connected to the figure in the woods? I may never know, but one thing is certain. Whatever it wasn't human. And it's an experience that still haunts me to this day. Reflection in the cabinet. It was about 4 years ago when I first encountered something I still struggle to comprehend. The memory lingers with a vividness that chills me, especially every time I pass by that old china cabinet. It all began on a quiet evening when I was watching a late-night special on TV about an unsolved case from over a decade ago. The program centered around the tragic death of a young girl who was brutally murdered during a family camping trip. Although the incident occurred 12 years prior, the case had resurfaced, sparking renewed interest and coverage. I remember feeling a deep sense of unease as I watched, but nothing could have prepared me for what would happen just a few hours later. It was around 10 p.m. when I left the living room and made my way to the dining area. In that room stands an antique china cabinet, a family heirloom passed down from my great-grandmother. The cabinet is an ornate piece with large glass doors that reflect everything in the room like a mirror. Whenever you walk by, your reflection is unavoidable. I'd walked past it countless times before, never giving it a second thought. But this night was different. As I moved across the room, I caught sight of myself in the reflection. But I wasn't alone. Next to me, in the glass, was the image of a little girl, pale, with dark circles under her eyes and a forlorn expression that conveyed both sorrow and anger. Her face was hauntingly familiar. It didn't take long for me to realize that she was the very same girl I'd seen on the news earlier that night. She looked almost ghostly, wearing what appeared to be a long white nightshirt, her feet bare. The way she stared at me felt as if she was not just watching, but trying to communicate some deep, unspoken grief. Time seemed to freeze. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. My heart pounded in my chest, but my limbs felt as if they were made of stone. I could do nothing but stand there, locked in that eerie gaze. Her eyes, so hollow and dark, bored into mine, radiating a mixture of sadness and rage. I could almost feel the weight of her emotions pressing down on me, as though she was trying to make me understand the depth of her suffering. I don't know how long I stood there, staring back at her, but it felt like an eternity. When I finally snapped out of it, sheer terror took over. I bolted from the dining room, tears streaming down my face. I was so overwhelmed that I could barely breathe, let alone speak. When I found my parents, all I could do was sob uncontrollably. My words came out as jumbled fragments, and it wasn't long before I began to feel dizzy and lightheaded, on the verge of passing out. I never fully explained to them what I saw. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. Who would? For days afterward, I avoided the dining room entirely. Even during the day, I couldn't bring myself to go near that cabinet. The image of that little girl haunted my every thought. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that she was still watching me from the shadows. It wasn't just fear, it was sorrow too, a deep, lingering sadness that I couldn't shake. I felt as if I had glimpsed something far darker than just a ghost. It was as though I had seen a manifestation of unresolved anguish, trapped in this world with no way to find peace. I later learned that the girl's murder had taken place not far from where I live, which only deepened my sense of unease. Her case had gone cold, and her killer was never found. The realization that her spirit might still be seeking justice or simply longing for someone to acknowledge her pain left a lasting impression on me. Was that why she appeared to me? Did she sense that I'd watched her story and chose that moment to reach out, hoping for some form of recognition? There's one more thing that happened, something I've never told anyone until now. A week after the incident, I worked up the courage to return to the dining room. I had convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, or maybe a lingering influence from watching the news special. But when I stood in front of that cabinet again, a chill ran down my spine. The glass was slightly fogged, as if someone had breathed on it, and in the condensation I saw faint smudge marks, like small handprints. They were child-sized, too high to be from any kid I know, and the way they were positioned suggested someone had pressed their hands against the glass from inside the cabinet. I've since moved out of that house, but the memory of that night is etched in my mind. I often wonder if the girl ever found peace, or if she's still out there, trying to make herself known, hoping that someone, anyone, will hear her story and not forget her. I can only hope that wherever she is, she's no longer trapped in that reflection, staring out with those mournful eyes, desperate for the rest she never found in life. Spirits on the old banyan tree. Around 4 years ago, my curiosity led me and a close friend to one of the most mysterious places in Okinawa, the sacred Banyan forest said to be home to the legendary Kijimuna spirits. These childlike beings, known in local folklore as playful but unpredictable tree-dwelling spirits, have intrigued locals for generations. Some say they resemble small, mischievous children with fiery red hair and can either bring fortune or wreak havoc depending on how they perceive you. But what we encountered on that trip went beyond any urban legend and left a haunting imprint on our memories. Our journey began innocently enough. We'd already explored much of Okinawa and heard about the legends surrounding these spirits. This time, we hired a local guide, a photographer with extensive knowledge of the island's history and folklore. He promised to take us to one of the oldest banyan trees in the region, a site known for its supposed connection to the Kijimuna. His lighthearted tone about maybe spotting one if we're lucky belied the eeriness of the location we were about to visit. As we arrived at the forest's edge, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the twisted roots and gnarled branches of the banyan trees. The air was thick with humidity, and despite the warmth, an inexplicable chill ran down my spine. Our guide pointed out the largest and oldest tree in the grove. "This tree is believed to be a gathering place for the Kijimuna," he said with a grin. "They're like Okinawa's version of the Zashiki Warashi, spirits that bring fortune if they like you, but trouble if they don't." He told us a story of a man who had unknowingly angered a Kijimuna by cutting down a sacred tree. The man's misfortune had followed him relentlessly until he made amends at a local shrine. That night, we checked into a nearby hotel that overlooked the banyan forest. Our room was on the second floor, with a veranda offering a clear view of the trees. As night fell, my friends stood on the veranda, breathing in the night air while I busied myself checking our flight details for our return trip to Hokkaido. The stillness of the night was broken when my friend called out to me. "Hey, come here! You have to see this!" she said, her voice tinged with excitement and a bit of unease. I joined her on the veranda, following her gaze toward the tallest banyan tree in the distance. The night was unnervingly calm. No wind, no rustling leaves, yet the branches of that one tree swayed as if someone or something was climbing through it. "Do you see that?" she asked. "There's no wind, but that tree is moving." I squinted, trying to make sense of it. "Maybe it's a ranger or something," I suggested, though I knew it didn't add up. The forest was supposed to be uninhabited, and there weren't any houses for miles. It couldn't be kids playing in the dark, and besides, the motion was too deliberate, too purposeful, like someone was methodically scaling the tree. We both fell silent, the unsettling sight gnawing at our nerves. I made a half-hearted joke about going to see the Kijimuna up close, but neither of us were eager to venture into that forest after dark. Instead, we shut the veranda doors and tried to sleep, though the oppressive heat and the creeping sense of dread made it difficult. Later that night, both of us were jolted awake by the sound of faint footsteps outside our room. The soft padding was accompanied by a faint, melodic singing, the kind you'd hear in a children's nursery rhyme. My heart raced as I strained to listen. It wasn't just one voice. It sounded like a chorus of young children singing in unison. I could make out the words, though the tune was unfamiliar, echoing with a hollow, almost otherworldly quality. "Stay here," I whispered to my friend, who was visibly shaken. Grabbing a flashlight, I cautiously stepped out onto the veranda. The singing grew clearer, but the source was elusive, as if the voices were carried on the night air from deep within the forest. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, small figures darting between the shadows of the banyan trees. They moved too quickly for me to get a clear look, but their shapes were unmistakably childlike. The footsteps continued, circling around the hotel as if whatever was out there was playing a game, taunting us. Terrified, I retreated back inside. We spent the rest of the night wide awake, huddled in our room, every creak and rustle setting our nerves on edge. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The next day, we questioned our guide about what we had experienced. He listened quietly, his expression growing more serious. "You might have encountered the spirits of the forest," he said. "There are stories of people hearing children's voices or seeing strange movements at night, but it's rare. The Kijimuna are usually harmless, but if you disturb them or enter their territory uninvited, they can become mischievous or worse." Determined to find some rational explanation, we searched the area for any signs of intruders, footprints, broken branches, anything. But the ground was undisturbed, the forest eerily pristine as if nothing had been there at all. Before we left, I stood on the veranda one last time, staring at the banyan tree that had moved so unnervingly the night before. In the daylight, it looked ordinary, its ancient branches swaying gently in the breeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, just beyond the line of trees, hidden in the shadows. To this day, I can't say for certain what we encountered that night. Were they truly the Kijimuna? Or were they something else? Something older and more dangerous that has lingered in those woods for centuries? Whatever it was, the memory lingers. A reminder that some legends are not merely stories, and that there are places where the boundary between our world and the spirit realm grows perilously thin. Camping next to a cemetery. I was living in Malaysia when this incident occurred, around the time I was in 6th grade. Our school had organized a camping trip for 3 days and 2 nights, an exciting prospect for a bunch of kids ready for adventure. However, our enthusiasm took a nosedive when we arrived at the campsite and realized that I was located right next to an old, overgrown cemetery. The air was thick with humidity, and the rustling trees seemed to whisper warnings of what was to come. The campsite consisted of 2 long wooden cabins, one for the girls and one for the boys. Inside each cabin, rows of creaky double-decker bunk beds lined the walls. Despite the eerie setting, the first day was full of typical camping activities, hiking, games, and a bonfire. By the time night fell, everyone was exhausted, and we headed to bed early, eager for sleep. I climbed into the top bunk, still trembling with the nervous energy that came from being a scaredy cat at that age. It was around 2 a.m. when I suddenly woke up. The cabin was pitch dark, with only faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. A strange, muffled noise caught my attention, tiny whimpering sounds like someone trying to scream but holding back. I peered into the darkness, squinting to locate the source. The noises were coming from the other side of the room, near the door. There, on the bottom bunk, a girl from another class was thrashing in her bed, her eyes wide with terror. She was frantically shaking her friend, trying to wake her up. My heart started pounding as I leaned forward to see what she was so afraid of. That's when I noticed it, a figure standing beside her bed, half obscured by shadows. The figure was that of an old woman with long, tangled white hair hanging over her face. Her skin was ashen, almost decaying, and she wore a tattered white dress stained with dirt. But what terrified me the most was her face, or what was left of it. Her eyes were sunken, and a third eye, grotesquely large, sat in the center of her forehead. The woman's lips twisted into a cruel smile as she pointed a bony, rotting finger at the girl, her long nails blackened and cracked. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at the terrified girl, as if relishing the fear she was causing. I was paralyzed with fear. The bed creaked beneath me every time I moved, and I was terrified that if I made any noise, the woman would notice me. The girl had given up on waking her friend and scrambled over to the other side of the bed, hiding under her blanket. But the woman didn't vanish. She remained there, silently staring at the quivering lump under the blanket. I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly slid under my blanket, holding my breath and squeezing my eyes shut. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, frozen in terror, until sleep finally claimed me. The next day, I was relieved that nothing more had happened during the night. But our eerie experiences were far from over. On the second night, things took an even more terrifying turn. After a small evening concert in the outdoor hall, my friends and I decided to head to the bathroom before turning in for the night. The toilets were located far from the cabins, near the edge of the cemetery. It was pitch dark, and our only source of light was a weak flashlight. There were 3 stalls in the bathroom, but the lights weren't working, and the place had a damp, suffocating atmosphere. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and mildew. We decided to take turns. One person would hold the door open for light, one would stand guard, and the last would do their business. I was the last to go, and just as I was finishing up, I heard my friends screaming my name from outside the stall. "Hurry up! There's something on the ceiling," one of them shouted. My blood ran cold. My hands shook as I fumbled to pull up my pants, but I dared not look up. As I opened the stall door, my friends were already halfway out of the bathroom, sprinting toward the cabins. I didn't look back either. I bolted as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. But as we ran, we heard heavy footsteps behind us, gaining speed as they followed us. Whatever was chasing us wasn't just close, it was breathing down our necks. We didn't dare turn around, we just kept running, our screams echoing through the night. When we finally reached the hall where the other campers were gathered, the footsteps stopped abruptly. We turned around, gasping for breath, but there was nothing there, just the eerie silence of the night. Shaken, we returned to our cabin. I tried to convince myself it was just our imagination, but the fear gnawed at me. This time I took the bottom bunk, but it did little to calm my nerves. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to forget the phantom footsteps chasing us. At around 4 a.m., I woke up to a slow, deliberate tapping on the window behind my bunk. The window was an old wooden one with gaps that allowed every sound from outside to seep in. The tapping grew louder, and then I heard it, slow, dragging footsteps right outside. They circled the cabin, shuffling through the gravel as if something was pacing back and forth. My heart raced as I tried to wake my friend next to me, but she wouldn't stir. Desperate and terrified, I climbed into the top bunk with another friend and buried myself under her blanket. She shifted in her sleep, mistaking me for a pillow, but I didn't care. I just needed to hide from whatever was outside. Eventually, the footsteps faded away, and I must have drifted off to sleep. Morning came, and the sunlight brought a false sense of security. We packed our bags, eager to leave the cursed place behind. As the bus pulled away, I couldn't help but glance back at the cemetery. The gnarled trees swayed gently in the breeze, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us leave. I've never returned to that campsite, and I never will. They say camping next to a cemetery is bound to bring bad luck, but after what we went through, I'm convinced it's more than that. There are things that linger in places where the living and the dead intersect, and sometimes those things want more than just to be seen. They want to follow you home. Merry Christmas from the other side. It was the last Christmas we had together. My mom, ever thoughtful, gave me a large tin filled with assorted popcorn, a holiday staple in our family. The tin was nearly a foot tall, adorned with a serene image of an angel. After we finished the popcorn, I decided to use them to store old photographs that had been scattered in drawers and boxes over the years. Inside were memories of camping trips, family reunions, and candid moments with cousins. It became a time capsule of the good times, a piece of the past kept safe. Months would go by, and I'd occasionally reach for that tin when I felt like reminiscing. I'd open it, expecting to find it packed with photos, only to notice that it seemed half empty. It was odd, but I brushed it off, assuming I had taken pictures out and misplaced them. Sometimes I'd open it and find just a few photos left at the bottom. The once overflowing collection was dwindling, and I couldn't understand why. No one else had access to the tin, and I hadn't moved them anywhere. As Christmas approached again, I decided it was time to finally sort the photos into albums, something I had been meaning to do for years. I brought out the tin, now significantly lighter than I remembered. The photos my mom had given me before she passed away were still inside, but the collection was sparse compared to what it used to be. I set them aside, intending to organize them later, but life got in the way. One night, just a few days before Christmas, I found myself alone, watching TV while festive lights twinkled in the background. My mind wandered to memories of past holidays and the loved ones I had lost. The house felt quieter than usual, the absence of those who were once there hanging heavy in the air. I couldn't help but think of my mom, my brother, and other family members who had crossed over to the other side. I sat there flipping through the memories in my mind, silently greeting each of them. "Hello and Merry Christmas," I whispered, my eyes stinging with tears. With the warmth of nostalgia wrapping around me, I eventually drifted off to sleep. On Christmas Eve, I decided to go through the photos again. I reached for the old popcorn tin, intending to find a specific picture. When I lifted the lid, my heart skipped a beat. Right on top were photos of all the people I had been thinking of just nights before. My mom, my grandparents, and even my brother, smiling with his favorite dog by his side. The picture of my brother was one I had never seen before. In fact, our family had very few photos of him to begin with. How did this picture get here? And why were all these particular photos, the exact people I had greeted, suddenly at the top in the order I had remembered them? I sat there in disbelief, carefully pulling out each photo. They were perfectly arranged, as if someone or something had deliberately placed them there. My thoughts raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe I had forgotten about these photos or accidentally moved them around. But deep down, I knew this was different. The arrangement was too precise, too personal. The room was silent as I held the picture of my brother, staring at the smile that I had missed for so long. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a coincidence or a trick of the mind. This was a message. They were reaching out, saying hello and Merry Christmas in the only way they could. My eyes welled up, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. I had felt their presence before, subtle reminders like a familiar scent or a flicker of light, but never this tangible, this clear. In that moment, I realized that love truly transcends time and space. Our connection with those who have passed doesn't end when they're gone. It simply changes. The ones we miss may be on the other side, but they're never really far. As I carefully returned the photos to the tin, I whispered a heartfelt thank you and Merry Christmas back to them. I knew, somehow, they had heard me. That Christmas was different. It wasn't just about the presents or the festive lights. It was about the reminder that the bonds we share with those we love continue, even when they're no longer physically here. The popcorn tin still sits on my shelf, now a cherished keepsake holding not just memories, but a message from beyond. They say the holiday season is a time for miracles, and I believe it now more than ever. I never expected to receive a gift from the other side, but it's one I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. A reminder that love is eternal and that the ones we miss the most are never really gone. They're just a whisper away, sending their love from the other side. Garden of the Gods. It was the summer of 1984, and we were eager to break in the old Nimrod camper we'd just acquired. If you're unfamiliar, it's a pop-up tent that folds flat into a small trailer, easily towed behind a car. Our destination was the remote and rugged Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois. More specifically, we were headed to an area called the Garden of the Gods near Harrod, a place of stunning rock formations and deep valleys. The drive down was peaceful, with nothing but the whisper of wind through trees and the occasional chirp of crickets. But the peace was deceptive. Garden of the Gods is known for its eerie stillness, an unsettling silence that feels like the forest itself is holding its breath. The campsite we were assigned sat at the edge of a steep ravine. There were no hookups for water or electricity, just the basics. A fire pit, a picnic table, and an old vault toilet building a short walk away. We hadn't seen another soul since pulling into the forest. It was like we had entered a forgotten corner of the world. My husband, Matt, and our 2-year-old son, Josh, got busy setting up the camper. Josh, as always, was eager to help Daddy, though his version of helping was more like exploring every rock and twig within reach. I busied myself collecting firewood while the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the dense trees. It was just a normal camping trip, or so I thought. But the unsettling feeling that we weren't alone began gnawing at me the moment we arrived. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to whisper in a language I couldn't understand, or how the birds ceased their chirping as if in reverence to something lurking in the woods. I shrugged it off and focused on setting up camp. When I returned to the site with my arms full of firewood, Matt was still fiddling with the camper door. "Where's Josh?" I asked, noticing our son was no longer trailing behind his dad. "He's right," Matt began, but then stopped, his face draining of color as he realized Josh was nowhere in sight. We both started calling his name, searching frantically around the campsite. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. He was only too small, too vulnerable to be lost in a forest like this. I dropped to my knees where Josh had last been seen, trying to think like him. He wouldn't have gone far, I whispered to myself, scanning the ground for any trace, a footprint, a broken twig. Panic clawed at my throat as I strained my ears, listening for his little voice. But all I heard was the oppressive silence of the forest. Matt was trembling beside me. "I'll head back to the registration cabin and get help," he stammered. "You keep looking. Go," I snapped, not taking my eyes off the ground. I knew time was against us. The sun was setting, and soon it would be dark, too dark to see anything, let alone find a missing child. I forced myself to breathe deeply, to stay focused. I needed clarity, not panic. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a dark, child-sized figure darting between the trees on the ridge across the ravine. I spun around, squinting into the shadows. It looked like a boy, but not Josh. This one was older, maybe 6 or 7, and his form was barely more than a silhouette. He paused as if waiting for me to notice him, then ran deeper into the woods. Without a second thought, I took off after him, crashing through the underbrush. "Josh!" I screamed, hoping the shadowy figure would lead me to my son. The boy kept just out of reach, never letting me get close enough to see his face. My heart pounded in my ears as I stumbled over roots and rocks, following the dark figure deeper into the wilderness. It was only after a few minutes of frantic running that I realized how reckless I was being. I had no idea where I was anymore, and this boy, whoever or whatever he was, seemed more like a lure than a guide. I stopped dead in my tracks, forcing myself to listen to the forest. The wind rustled the leaves above, and somewhere far off, a branch snapped. But beneath the usual forest sounds, I heard a faint whisper, a voice that was neither human nor animal. It was ancient, and it sent a chill crawling up my spine. "Leave a trail," a voice inside my head urged. It sounded like an old man's voice, rough and gravelly. "Won't do you any good to get lost yourself." I snapped off branches and tore up flowers as I moved, hoping to leave some sign for Matt or anyone who might come looking. I saw the shadowy figure again, this time closer and more distinct. It wasn't just a boy, but something darker, older, with eyes that seemed to glint like dull embers in the fading light. "This way," he whispered, pointing deeper into the forest. Fear gripped me, but I followed. I didn't have a choice. If this thing was leading me to Josh, I had to go. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to twist and warp. The trees leaned in unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky. The path grew darker, and the temperature dropped as if I had walked into a tomb. Suddenly, the shadow boy vanished, leaving me standing in a small clearing. At the center was a massive, ancient tree with a hollowed-out trunk. The entrance to the hollow looked like a tunnel leading into blackness. I dropped to my knees in front of it. My breath caught in my throat as I heard a faint whimper from inside. "Josh?" I called, my voice trembling. Slowly, I crawled forward, peering into the darkness. And there, huddled in the very back of the hollow, was my son. Tears blurred my vision as I reached in and pulled him into my arms. He was real, warm, solid, alive. "Mommy," he sobbed, clinging to me. "Where were you? What happened?" I asked, still shaking. "I was with the boy," Josh said, pointing back into the hollow. "He said it was safe here. He told me to hide." I looked back at the entrance, but the shadow was gone. Only darkness remained. I scooped Josh up and hurried back the way I had come, following the trail of snapped branches and torn flowers. My mind raced with questions. Who or what was that shadowy figure? And why did it help us? When we finally made it back to the campsite, Matt was there with a park ranger and a couple of volunteers. Relief flooded their faces when they saw us, but as I relayed what had happened, the ranger's expression grew serious. "That boy," the ranger said quietly. "I've heard stories about him, Bashram. Local legend says he's the spirit of a child who went missing in these woods decades ago. People claim to see him leading lost children to safety, though not everyone who follows him comes back." We packed up and left the Garden of the Gods that night, cutting our trip short. I didn't care that we'd driven hours to get there. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. Years later, when I told this story to an elder in the town nearby, he said, Chaska. It's a name that means firstborn son in the Sioux language. You were lucky, ma'am. That spirit was protecting your boy. Even now, I wonder who or what was really out there in the woods that day. Was it a benevolent spirit or something darker playing tricks? One thing I know for sure is that we never went back to that cursed place, and I still shudder every time I think of the hollow tree, where shadows linger and whisper secrets only the forest understands. Violent camping trip. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. A camping trip meant to bring us closer as a family. My parents had recently bought a used camper, an old clunker from the 70s, faded and rusted in spots, but still functional. My dad was excited to test it out, so we packed our things and headed to a remote campground deep in the woods. My brother Pat, 9 years older than me, was less enthusiastic, but he tagged along anyways, his headphones glued to his ears most of the trip. I was only 4 at the time, but I remember it all vividly, like it happened yesterday. We arrived at the campsite just before dusk. The area was eerily quiet, not another camper in sight. Tall pines surrounded us, casting long shadows in the fading light. There was something unsettling about the place, a heaviness in the air, but as a child I couldn't quite put my finger on it. My mom, always one to sense things, seemed uneasy, but she brushed it off as nerves. My dad laughed it off, saying it was just an old campsite, probably built on some sour soil or something silly like that. That night, we built a fire and tried to enjoy some family time. I remember burning my hands on the hot, gooey marshmallows as we made s'mores. We roasted hot dogs too, but something felt off. The silence was too deep, too unnatural. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, the usual nighttime chorus of crickets and owls absent. We all went inside the camper as night fell, thinking the quiet was just part of the remote wilderness. Inside, my mom tucked me into bed beside her while my brother and dad settled into their own sleeping spaces. I wasn't tired, having slept on the drive there, so I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the camper creaked in the cool night air. That's when the real nightmare began. A sudden bang jolted me upright. The camper shook violently, as if something massive had collided with it. My mom clutched me tightly, her face drained of color. She called out to my dad and Pat, but they didn't respond. They were out cold, as if something had forced them into an unnatural sleep. The banging grew louder, and now it was coming from all sides of the camper. Something was circling us, pounding on the thin metal walls with a ferocity that rattled the entire structure. Then came the scratching. Long, screeching claws dragged across the roof, sending shivers down my spine. My mom's hands trembled as she fumbled for her prayer book. She began reciting verses, her voice shaky but determined. Whatever was outside seemed to react to her prayers. It grew more enraged, slamming against the windows and doors, trying to force its way in. I tried to peek through the curtains, curious and terrified at the same time. My mom pulled me back, but not before I caught a glimpse of a shadow, a grotesque figure, hunched over and covered in thick scales, like something out of a prehistoric nightmare. It moved with unnatural speed and power, its form barely recognizable as anything from this world. It wasn't a bear or any animal we knew. It was something else, something malevolent. Hours dragged on. The attacks on the camper never stopped. My mom's prayers were the only thing keeping it from breaking through, or so it seemed. At one point, my dad's breathing grew shallow, almost as if he were suffocating. My mom frantically shook him awake, only for him to fall back into a deep, unnatural sleep moments later. She believed the creature outside was trying to possess him, or worse, kill him while he slept. Pat woke up briefly, mumbling something about a bad dream, but he too was quickly drawn back into sleep, oblivious to the chaos. I stayed awake the entire time, too terrified to close my eyes. I clung to my mom, who whispered prayers over and over, her voice growing hoarse as the night dragged on. Outside, the creature's relentless pounding and clawing continued, growing more frenzied as the hours passed. As dawn approached, a pale light filtered through the curtains. The creature's attacks slowly weakened, its strength seemingly fading with the rising sun. But even in daylight, the terror wasn't over. My brother finally woke up, rubbing his eyes as if nothing had happened. He ignored my mom's desperate warnings and insisted on going outside to retrieve his shoes, which he had left by the campfire the night before. Despite everything, he was more concerned about his brand new vans than the horrors we had just endured. He returned minutes later, unharmed but shaken. "You have to see this," he said, his face pale. We stepped outside and saw the damage. The camper was covered in deep claw marks, each 1 inches deep, as if made by some colossal beast. There were footprints, too. 3 toed impressions pressed into the mud, each print nearly as big as a dinner plate. Whatever had attacked us wasn't human, and it wasn't something any of us had seen before. My dad finally woke up, groggy and unaware of what had happened. My mom showed him the claw marks and footprints, but he remained skeptical, chalking it up to wild animals and overactive imaginations. He laughed it off, even as other campers gathered around, whispering about the noise they had heard during the night. But my mom wasn't taking any chances. She demanded we leave immediately, and for once, my dad didn't argue. We packed up in record time and drove away, the eerie silence of the woods hanging over us like a bad omen. As we drove home, the tension began to lift, but a new sorrow awaited us. When we got back, we discovered my brother's cat, Jimmy, had been left in our trailer, trapped inside with the heater running for days. The poor cat was barely alive. We rushed him to the vet, but it was too late. Jimmy had to be put down. My mom, deeply religious and superstitious, believed the creature had somehow cursed us, reaching out even after we escaped. Losing Jimmy felt like a final blow from whatever malevolent force had tormented us that night. My parents sold the camper soon after, convinced it was cursed. It ended up in my uncle's possession, but that's a story for another time. As for me, I'll never forget that night. I was only 4, but the fear and the images are burned into my memory. My mom and I still talk about it sometimes, though my dad and brother prefer to pretend it never happened. But I know what I saw, what we all experienced. There's darkness out there in the world, lurking in places where the veil between our world and the unknown is thin. If you ever find yourself in an isolated campground, far from civilization, listen closely to the silence. Sometimes the quiet hides things that are better left undisturbed. Be careful where you choose to camp. You never know what might be waiting in the shadows, just beyond the firelight. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.